Hi, everyone. As I was grading Writing Project 3, I came across quite a few issues with using MLA format, properly citing sources, avoiding plagiarism. So I wanted to make a video in which I go over some notes on those things. What I'm presenting here is what I view as basically the most essential pieces of information that you need to know. Avoiding plagiarism is one of the most important things that we cover in this course. And even though I assigned a few readings on it, we did some tasks on Blackboard that covered how to cite sources, how to avoid plagiarism. I didn't get the sense that everyone had fully understood those topics and how to best put them into practice. And so I don't really feel that we can kind of just let the course come to an end without making sure that everyone has at least a working knowledge of how to properly cite sources in MLA and how to avoid plagiarizing. So before I jump into the notes, I want to talk a little bit about why plagiarism is a big deal and also what some of the consequences of it can be. So plagiarism is effectively stealing. It's taking someone else's ideas, thoughts, words, and presenting them as your own. And whether or not you do it on purpose, it is a big deal. If you were an artist and you created a work of art, you would want to get credit for that. You would probably be upset if someone else used it for their own purposes or tried to pass it off as their own. If you were, a writer or a musical artist and you produced something and someone took your words or took your music and used it without your permission, that would be something that most people would find upsetting. And it's the same thing with academic writing, where we want to make sure that we are giving credit to the people who actually came up with those ideas. And it is something that is treated very seriously in colleges and universities and in some workplaces as well. At the college level, typically the policy of most professors, most institutions is that if you are caught doing it once, then that results in a zero for the assignment. And if you are caught doing it a second time, then you can be kicked out of the course and potentially even kicked out of the college or university. So it's very a serious issue, and it's important that we know how to avoid it. So with that being said, I want to go over, like I said, some essential notes on this topic. So in MLA, what does it mean to cite something? First of all, you need to have an in-text citation. Usually this is the author's last name and a page number. Now, in-text citation is also the same thing as a parenthetical citation or a citation in parentheses. Those terms are basically interchangeable. So sometimes you'll hear someone say one, sometimes you'll hear the other. Basically the same thing. If there's no author's name, you can use an abbreviated version of the source's title. And if there's no page number, then you don't need to put one. In addition to having the in-text citation, and so this is every time that you quote something, paraphrase something, in some way reference someone else's thoughts or ideas or use their words, you should have an in-text citation. Next, you should also have a signal phrase. Hopefully this is not a new idea to you. We've covered them in a couple different ways in class. A signal phrase is a group of words that shows your reader where your information is coming from. And usually that signal phrase is the author's names, and sometimes it will be the title of the source. In MLA, we usually go with the author's names. So some examples here I have for you. You might have, according to sheriff, there has been an increase in car accidents in recent years. My signal phrase is this right here, according to sheriff. So this connects my quote here to the rest of my sentence. It flows together pretty nicely, and it tells my readers where I'm getting my information from. I'm getting it from the author Sheriff. Next, let's say that you're not quoting and instead you are paraphrasing or summarizing a source. Also, in this example, I don't mention the author's name. So, in the book Tales of the Samurai, the author recounts several stories from medieval Japanese tradition. This is my signal phrase. It tells my reader where my information is coming from. Now, I will say a bit of a caveat here. Technically, signal phrases are not always required, but it's better to be safe than to be sorry. Most professors that you encounter will be pleased to see that you are using signal phrases, and there's usually not ever a time where you wouldn't want to use one. I just wanted to let you know that technically they're not always required. You will sometimes see people not use them, but generally just better to have them than to not. Finally, your source needs to be on your works cited page. So as a bit of a recap here, make sure you have the in-text citation, make sure you have a signal phrase, and then also make sure that it is in the works cited page. So it's not enough to properly quote something in your essay. The source also needs to be on your works cited page. So even if you have a signal phrase, even if you're using that in-text citation, if you don't have a works cited page, that's still technically plagiarism. And the inverse is true as well. It's not enough to just put a source on your works cited page. It also needs to be properly cited within the essay itself. So you really need to make sure that you're doing both things. Next, let's talk about what needs to be cited. First of all, other people's words. Almost anytime you take someone else's words, they need to be cited. This is not a hard and fast rule, but generally what I suggest for people is if you take more than 3 to 4 words in a row that someone else wrote, so they're not your words, they need to be put into quotes. And then on top of that, just to be safe, any unique words or terms that you are using from someone else should also be put into quotes. Even if it's just a single word or just a couple of words, still better to put it in quotes. To think of this another way, if you are using someone else's word and it's a word that you normally wouldn't use, or a word that you didn't know the definition of, you had to go look it up, or you just feel like it's an especially interesting word, usually it's better to quote it than to not quote it. But just to be safe, anytime you use someone else's words, make sure that they're in quotation marks, make sure there's a signal phrase, make sure there is an in-text citation. Next, other people's ideas. So even if you include a source on your works cited page, you still need to give credit to the author within the essay. We just said this a minute ago. Even if you aren't quoting it. So even if you aren't using someone's exact words, you're changing the wording a little bit, you're putting it in your own words, that's still someone else's idea. And so you need the signal phrase, you need the in-text citation. And finally, this one is actually, I don't see this as often. Usually you only see it in certain types of writing. But if you take someone else's organization or the structure of their paper, that's also something that you should cite. So if you're directly copying a source's organization, you should give that source credit. And finally here, now this isn't really on the topic of plagiarism, this is more of just in the topic of using sources. If you say something that isn't common knowledge, you should back it up with a source. So to explain that a little bit more, if you say something in your paper that the average person wouldn't know or wouldn't understand, you should support it with a source. Now, I will say that the average person kind of depends on who is in your audience. Well, let me give you a general example to start with. So if you walked up to any person on the street and asked them who the first president of the United States is, there's a very good chance that they could tell you that it was George Washington. That's something that we would call common knowledge. But if you walked up to someone on the street and asked them to recite the 21st Amendment to the Constitution, Well, that's something that most people probably couldn't do without looking it up. So that is something that we would need to cite or to back up with a source. Now, what I was saying a minute ago is it also kind of depends on who is in your audience. So if I'm writing a paper to a bunch of other English professors, what we think of as common knowledge may be different than if I am writing to my students or to a general audience. And the same goes for lots of different disciplines. You know, if you're a computer scientist and you are writing something that is going to be read by other computer scientists, then your understanding of what is common knowledge is going to change based on that audience. So it is a little bit flexible, but in general, if it's not common knowledge, you should back it up with a source. And finally, if you present a fact or make a claim in your paper that is like pretty debatable, like something that you could, reasonably argue, like there are multiple sides to it, that should also be supported with a source. I saw this a little bit in people's papers where people would sort of just make a generalization as if it was a definitive fact, or people would claim something that was maybe slightly controversial or slightly debatable and not back it up with a source. Those sorts of things, just to be safe, should be given sources. And like I said, that isn't a matter of plagiarism. It's more about establishing your credibility as a writer. You lose credibility if you just say things without supporting them or make generalizations that aren't being backed up by a source. So those are, like I said, what I view as kind of the essential notes on avoiding plagiarism. If you have any questions or you want me to clarify anything, I would be happy to do so.